Okay, I think we can start. Good afternoon once again, everyone. I'm really pleased to welcome you all today for our webinar, which is entitled Ethiopia at a Crossroads, Complexity, Resilience, and Emerging Opportunities. Let me just briefly start by introducing myself. My name is Helena Terfe. I'm the lead advisor at Africa Practice, and I'm based between Dakar and Johannesburg. I come from a development background, mainly managing programs and projects in various social sectors such as health, agriculture, WASH, and education. I have been in Africa Practice for the last 2 years, mainly managing one of our key projects in West and Central Africa. And prior to Africa Practice, I have worked in an advisory firm based out of Dakar, and also worked within the UN system and the World Bank for over 10 years. As you know, this event is convened by Africa Practice, and just briefly, please allow me to give you a very short introduction on who we are. As some of you may probably know or may have seen from our website, we are a mission-led consulting firm solely working and focused on Africa. We're 20 years old, and in the last decade or so, we have advised and worked with various global investors, development partners, governments, and global philanthropies. In terms of our services, we specialize in political economy analysis, public policy solutions, campaigning, impact evidence and design, and data and AI-powered insights. So if you would like to know more about us, please feel free to reach out to us and we can provide additional information. Next, just before we begin, I have a few housekeeping announcements. I would like to remind all participants that this session is being held under the Chatham House, which means you're free to use the information shared, but not necessarily disclose and identify the affiliation of the speakers or the participants. Also, I would like to request and remind participants to keep microphones off, cameras off. You can continuously use the chat box to share some of your questions throughout the session. And once we're done with the main presentation, then we'll move on to the Q&A session towards the end. In cases where we may not be able to address all of your questions, rest assured that we will make a point of preparing a follow-up note and share with you all. Now, let me now move to the most exciting part of the day. I'll first start by introducing our lead speaker, Theodros Seele. He's the lead advisor at Africa Practice, and he specializes in political, regulatory, reputational risk advisory across sub-Saharan Africa. He brings over a decade of experience, advising global philanthropies, corporates, and governments. His work, focuses mainly on market entry, expansion strategies, and scenario-based planning in a complex and dynamic environment. So Theodros, prior to joining Africa Practice, he worked as a freelance political intelligence consultant and a project manager, focused mainly on the Horn of Africa. He also has experience as a management consultant and policy analyst for government departments. Theodros holds 2 master's degrees, one on international studies and diplomacy from SOAS, and the second one in social and political science from the University of Cambridge. He is also a native speaker of Amharic and Tigrinya. In addition to Theodros, we are also joined today by a couple of Africa Practice colleagues who have really a deep expertise and insight into the Horn of Africa. So rest assured, they will be on hand to contribute to the discussion or to answer any of your questions. So without further ado, I'll now turn it over to Theodros. He will give us a lowdown of the internal trajectories in Ethiopia. He will touch on regional dynamics, and he'll shed light on how we can navigate this complexity. And the main objective is really not to simplify the situation, but to really unpack this complexity and really offer a very realistic yet constructive assessment of the situation in Ethiopia. Over to you, Teddy.
Thank you. Thank you, Helena, for that introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here today and to the discussion that's going to ensue. So, as Helena has mentioned, today we'll be taking a deep dive into Ethiopia's trajectory over the past 7 years, a period that began with intense optimism and has seen since the country navigate a complex array of challenges and opportunities. And we're really looking at where things stand now, especially with an eye towards the 2026 general elections. But before we go into where we were 7 years ago, then leading on to the country's internal trajectory, and then looking at the broader regional and geopolitical picture, I just wanted to start with a quote which I have seen recently that has really summed up what it means to operate in Ethiopia, either in terms of entry, operating on a daily basis, or even expanding across the country, which is this quote here from Growth Africa. Success in Ethiopia requires patience, even by African standards. So I'm going to leave that here for the moment as I introduce the webinar and really take you back to 7 years ago to April 2018. Now, many of us will recall that period when Dr. Abiy Ahmed and his new administration came in, the phenomenon of Abiy Mania. And Abiy Mania wasn't just a domestic event, it really resonated across the continent and further afield. And it was reminiscent of much of the hope that surrounded a new generation of leaders in the early 90s, when many of the leaders that took power in the early 1990s, post the Cold War, were deemed the new Renaissance leaders of Africa. And Dr. Abiy moved quickly to solidify his base, embarking on extensive tours within Ethiopia, visiting every single region and speaking to the population, and then also holding mass public meetings like the ones you see in some of the pictures on this slide, not just domestically, but also with the politically engaged diaspora in the US, in Europe, in South Africa, and the UAE. On political liberalization, evidenced by the release of all jail journalists, the return of both non-armed and armed opposition groups to the country, was accompanied by a call for economic liberalization, a real proposed shift from the state-led economic development model that had gained traction over the past 3 decades under the rule of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF. And simultaneously, at the same time, he also carved out a role as a regional peacemaker, notably working to bring the two sides in South Sudan together, and most critically, breaking the nearly 2-decade no war, no peace stalemate with Eritrea, an effort that earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. Now, where are we now? Fast forward 7 years. And with the 2026 general election on the horizon, the picture is much more nuanced. Much of that initial fervent optimism seen evidenced by initiatives such as having a gender equal cabinet for the first time in Ethiopian history, the proclamation of the country's first female president, President Sahle-Work Zewde, who you can see there in the bottom left with Dr. Abiy, and the first federal Supreme Court judge, female Supreme Court judge, has been replaced by a complex environment marked by profound challenges. And these challenges have undoubtedly heightened the risk for investors, but it remains that Ethiopia, a country of 130 million people, second most populous in Africa, linchpin in the Horn of Africa and Northeast Africa region, significant opportunities still exist. So from the opening up of the financial services sector expected to leap forward by the end of this year, through to proclamations opening up a raft of previously closed off sectors for foreign investment, from retail to real estate to agricultural and extension services, the horizon remains full of these opportunities. Now, the challenges are multifaceted. Internal conflicts have been a major factor, most notably the devastating war in northern Ethiopia, which impacted Tigray, Amhara, and Afar, and took a significant amount of political, socio-economic, and diplomatic capital for the country. And whilst the Pretoria Agreement was signed in November 2022, and the implementation of that remains ongoing, especially as it was a critical turning point, the country is still healing from the scars of that conflict. And it faces a staggering reconstruction bill, which initially was estimated at anywhere between 20 and 28 US billion dollars, but has now been revised upwards to $44 billion, a sum that dwarfs the country's foreign exchange reserves that often sit anywhere between $2 and $3 billion and equates to 37% of the current GDP. Beyond northern Ethiopia, insecurity continues to hamper multiple parts of the country, from the border regions such as Benishangul Gumuz, where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is located, and which we'll come back to later, and Gambela, where inter-ethnic and cross-border clashes intertwine with the volatile situation in South Sudan. And Ethiopia continues to battle these significant macroeconomic headwinds on top of this. Whilst inflation has dipped this fiscal year and it's projected to end the fiscal year at the end of June at 10%, which is the National Bank of Ethiopia's target, this comes after more than 2 years of inflation consistently being above 30%. Critical foreign exchange reserves shortages persist, which at one time were worsened by external shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And for context, the reason that was important, Ethiopia relied on Russia and Ukraine for about a fifth of its wheat imports prior to the conflict. These external pressures have obviously were of course exacerbated by the internal conflict, which further depleted the country's scarce foreign exchange reserves. Ethiopia's internal situation is deeply intertwined with evolving regional geopolitics. Historically, its geostrategic location has always made it a contested nation, and the country has strived to maintain a spectrum of friendly relations, from being the largest recipient of US bilateral aid in sub-Saharan Africa to top destination on the continent for both Chinese and Turkish investment. And more recently, we've seen Ethiopia develop a particularly close alliance with the United Arab Emirates, a nation rapidly becoming a much more robust geopolitical player on the continent, and specifically in Ethiopia, which we will unpack. And in amongst all of this, we've seen, as we look forward to the elections next year, a considerable strain on the country's ethno-federal government system. Fundamentally, what's emerged is a significant gap between the initial promise of the sweeping reforms and the stark reality of governing a vast and diverse country of nearly 130 million people, with 12 regions and 2 chartered cities, over 80 ethnic groups, and deeply entrenched structural, economic, socio-economic, diplomatic, and security challenges. So 7 years on from Abiy Mania, what does the internal trajectory really look like? As I mentioned, Abiy Mania swept the nation in 2018, partly fueled by the domestic political scene. And we have to remember, at the time, Ethiopia was emerging from over 3 years of significant political upheaval, marked by multiple states of emergency, with the state of emergency declared in 2016, extended twice, and widespread and nationwide protests demanding political and economic reform. And that was really as the existing social contract, where year-on-year double-digit economic growth under the EPRDF had to some extent been a substitute for political freedoms, was visibly fraying. It's also pertinent to note that we have convened this webinar in May, and May is an important month in Ethiopian political history. Just last year, the country marked 50 years since the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974, where the monarchy, which in some shape or form had existed for over 2,000 years, was overthrown. And then today is May 28th, or in the Ethiopian calendar, Gbot Haya, which in 1991 was the date when the Derg regime that took over from the monarchy was overthrown by the EPRDF. And the current Prosperity Party administration, whilst a rebranding of the EPRDF and expansion of the EPRDF's scope across Ethiopia, shares many of those characteristics and can really be seen as a continuation of that 1991 shift. The first dominant and recurring theme that's really been seen in Ethiopia's internal trajectory over the past 7 years has been a tension between the center, Addis Ababa, not just as the political capital, but the economic and cultural hub of the country and a diplomatic capital for the continent, and the regions. And this tension is deeply embedded in Ethiopia's political history. And over the past 7 years, these tensions have erupted into, as we've seen in the most extreme example, into full-blown conflict, as seen in Tigray, or led to political fragmentation, as we have seen with the breakup of the Southern Nations, Nationalities and Peoples region into 4 separate regions, namely Sidama, Southwestern Ethiopia, Southern Ethiopia, and Central Ethiopia, sometimes through violent processes, as was seen in Sidama, and then through peaceful referenda in other regions. Many of these tensions remain unresolved, with the new regions of Southwest Ethiopia, South Ethiopia, and Central Ethiopia not allaying calls by individual zones and ethnic groups for their own regional states as per the Ethiopian constitution. Calls we expect to ramp up in the run-up to the general elections next year. So when we look at the focus areas for these center region tensions, I'm going to use two examples. The first is Amhara, where the conflict that really led to a state of emergency being imposed in August 2023 continues, and there continue to be significant narrative gaps between federal and local accounts of insecurity. And in Tigray, where the focus remains as a result of the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement, one that was brokered by the African Union and has had significant attention as a result of the capital, the economic, political, diplomatic capital that Ethiopia lost as a result of that brutal conflict. And factional splits and concerns in the region still remain, especially around the full implementation of it, of the agreement and durability of the Pretoria Agreement itself. So as we look at these center region tensions, and we'll delve a bit into the insecurity in Amhara, Tigray, and Oromia, the most populous regional state, a bit later, what does this mean for the 2026 elections? Now, the 2021 elections were due in 2020, but they were delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and ironically, themselves became a flashpoint that then led on to the conflict which started in Tigray in November 2020 and then spread to the rest of northern Ethiopia. In 2021, we saw boycotts, particularly by the opposition in the largest region, Oromia, which saw a clean sweep for the ruling party. And then in other regions, we'd seen either races not held or delayed much later. And even where their opposition seats were won in isolated cases as part of the political liberalization process, Dr. Abiy made sure to widen cabinet participation, not just from the ruling Prosperity Party, but also inputting one minister each from the national movement of Amhara, Ethiopian Citizens for Social Justice, and then also the Oromo Liberation Front, three of the main opposition parties, and each of those parties continue to have a seat in cabinet. Now, for 2026, whilst another sweep by the Prosperity Party is anticipated and is the most likely scenario, the real question is whether the elections can be held on time, on budget, and uniformly across the country. Now, the first reason why is that this is complicated by the country's internal displacement crisis. At the end of March 2025, just under 2 million Ethiopians were internally displaced, with 2.8 million more returning to their original homes, but still not able to fully set up their lives again. And critically, and more importantly, Ethiopia has not had a census since 2007, making accurate voter registration incredibly difficult, with displacement and lack of an accurate census, which is vital in a system that relies on ethnic federalism, not just for parliamentary seat allocation in the lower House of Representatives, but also in the upper house, the House of Federation, where seats are accorded based on a proportion of that ethnic group size as per census figures. Now, we expect to see significant political consolidation efforts leading up to the vote, including alliances between various opposition parties and or the opposition likely to either boycott or participate in a way that doesn't significantly challenge the ruling party's dominance. Now, it's crucial to understand that whilst this is a national election, the dynamics will vary dramatically from region to region. In Oromia, the question is, will opposition parties participate, the Oromo Federal Conference, the Oromo Liberation Front, for example? In Amhara, how will the ongoing state of emergency and the conflict there impact polling? And in Tigray, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, core and lead party within the EPRDF, historically the dominant player, has had its registration cancelled by the National Electoral Board, a major factor for the context there. These localized dynamics are something we at Africa Practice will continue to explore in detail as we approach the elections and build out scenarios for how the elections will turn out. Now, I've mentioned at various points the role of insecurity and security matrix. So I want to dive into what the security matrix looks like in the three most populous regions, which are Oromia, Amhara, and Tigray. So firstly, let's start with Oromia, the most populous region. The conflict here has been mostly centered in the Western Oromia region, And it's actually been a long lingering issue. And the states of emergency that I'd mentioned in 2016 was initially as a result of protests across the Oromia region, as a result of what was then the Addis Ababa master plan, and concerns that land from Oromo farmers surrounding Addis Ababa was being taken in order to fuel the expansion of the city. Now, this long lingering issue predates the conflict in northern Ethiopia between 2020 and 2022, but received much less international attention. And even back in 2018, amidst the optimism and amidst the Abiy mania and amidst the political and economic opening, parts of Western Oromia saw many issues like alleged human rights abuses and the shutdown of essential services such as telecoms and financial services, criticisms that were later leveled at the federal government in northern Ethiopia as actions taken by them. And a key factor here in the conflict was that the Oromo Liberation Front was not disarmed when it was invited back into the country in 2018. It had been in exile in Eritrea and had been being supported. Again, this was prior to the Ethiopia-Eritrea rapprochement. And unlike other groups, it was not disarmed. And various splinter groups have then taken their arms into Western Oromia and been fighting both the regional and local government. Now, whilst an agreement in December 2024 with the splinter faction has seen some integration into government positions, localized conflict in Oromia continues to persist. And then moving to Amhara, the security situation here is very much more intertwined with the aftermath of the Pretoria Agreement. The core issue really has been here a major disconnect between federal and regional forces, especially the armed militia known as FANO. Now, the FANO, for those who are not aware of, are a crucial ally to the federal military during the conflict in northern Ethiopia, and were widely praised not just by the administration and the federal military, but others more broadly for helping support the federal military in its aims in northern Ethiopia. Now, following the conflict and the end of the conflict and the end of the Pretoria Agreement, a subsequent federal government decision was made to disarm regional militias like the FANO and integrate them back into the national army. And it was met with particularly fierce resistance. The FANO viewed this as an attempt by the federal government to not only reclaim power, but as a sign of a lack of gratitude for their role in the conflict in supporting the federal military. And here we have to be cognizant that although it was the conflict in northern Ethiopia and it impacted particularly Tigray, Amhara, and Afar regions, no parties from either Amhara or Afar were parties to the Pretoria Agreement. That was directly between the federal government and the TPLF at the time. Now, this conflict has been ongoing since 2023. A state of emergency was instituted in August 2023, initially for 6 months, and then at the end of the 6 months, rather than being automatically renewed, nothing further was said by the administration. But we know from our insights on the ground that that state of emergency and many of its aspects still continue. And there continues to be a stark difference between official narratives of peace, both from the federal and regional government, and the reality in various districts of the region. And this highlights a crucial point for understanding Ethiopia, which is that Ethiopia's security dynamics are often hyper-localized and demand a granular understanding, sometimes down to the district level, in order to understand how to operate and navigate the situation in the region. And then thirdly, the security matrix, and finally in Tigray, post the Pretoria Agreement, we've seen a significant splintering within the TPLF, and actually this has been seen over the past year and over the past 6 months especially, culminate in various armed factions of the TPLF taking control of various institutions within the region, and a complete change in the interim administration leadership as well, and a concern that it is going to change from a domestic issue within the Tigray region or within Ethiopia more broadly to an issue that then brings in Eritrea and the federal government of Ethiopia, both supporting different sides of the TPLF. Now, this has been largely to do, and the divisions have largely centered on the pace and nature of the agreement's implementation. Now, one of the factions believes that the issues on progress on issues like the return of internally displaced persons, clarity on Eritrea's role going forward, transitional justice and restitution for alleged human rights abuses is too slow. Others advocate for patience, acknowledging the complexity and the fact that the 2-year period since the agreement is very short, especially given the strained relations with Eritrea and the ongoing conflict next door in Amhara, both of which are dynamics that are deeply intertwined with the conflict in the region. All of this to say that all of this security aspects, all of this insecurity, all of this broader change unfolds within a broader, severe humanitarian context. As mentioned previously, Ethiopia is the largest recipient of US bilateral aid. So the USAID funding freeze announced in January has had a profound impact, raising serious concerns for long-term development. For instance, the World Food Programme has announced the suspension of food aid for 650,000 malnourished women and children, and it's estimated that 3.6 million are at risk of losing food aid without the additional funding. And this comes off the back of 2 years of suspension of food aid, both by USAID and the World Food Programme, after concerns that food aid that was being given for vulnerable people was being sold on the commercial market, and had led to significant investigations by both of those agencies. And beyond the emergency food assistance area, the health sector is under immense strain. Now, government spending at the moment covers less than a third of health expenditure, with donors picking up a similar portion, 34%, as defined by the National Health Survey. And this is critical at this moment for 2 reasons. Firstly, we are entering another budget cycle. The Ethiopian fiscal year ends at the end of June, and Ethiopia is expected to launch yet another record-breaking budget after launching its first trillion plus budget last year. But also at the same time where we are seeing a nationwide doctor strike as a result of issues such as low pay and concerns that the few physicians that are emerging, or the physicians that are emerging from Ethiopian medical schools, are being poached and going to work in other countries. So the brain drain as well. Now, over the past couple of weeks, this has gained national attention because of the arrest of the medical union head and other doctors as well. And this is deeply concerning for the country because imagery, for example, of white-coated doctors in the back of police trucks is relatively negative, given that the government is continuing to negotiate with donors who are in some cases reducing their aid. And I've mentioned the USAID funding freeze, but we've seen funding cuts announced over the past year by other key bilateral donors for Ethiopia, be it France, the Netherlands, or the UK as well. And this broader changes in development spending and what it means for a country such as Ethiopia that has a significant donor input across multiple sectors of its socioeconomic sectors is something that we're going to be unpacking in a following webinar as well. Now, let's turn to the economy. I've spoken quite a lot about politics and security, and actually much of the focus during the first 7 years, and particularly in that initial period in 2018-2019, was on the political liberalization, political opening up seen by the new administration. For much of the past 7 years, that political trajectory, and particularly the conflict in northern Ethiopia, dominated discussions. However, alongside that, and stated by the administration, and even reflected in the change of the ruling party's name from the EPRDF through its transformation into the Prosperity Party, is a fundamental shift from the EPRDF era of the state-led economic development model, of which many aspects do still remain, to an emphasis on economic liberalization. And that really means opening up sectors that were traditionally controlled by the state to private investment, both domestic and foreign. Now, it firstly started off with telecommunications, a case study which we will go into a bit more detail later, in 2021, with the successful market entry of Safaricom into the Ethiopian market. But this is now being followed by most immediately the banking and insurance sector and the broader financial services sector, and then various other sectors being opened up as well. Now, this has created some tension between remnants of the old guard and new wave of reformers in key economic institutions. And those reformers include Governor Mamoun Mehratu at the National Bank, State Minister Dr. Eyob Tekkaling at the Ministry of Finance, through to Dr. Buruk Taye, who is the CEO of Ethiopian Investment Holdings, the country's sovereign wealth fund, and formerly Director General of the Ethiopian Capital Markets Authority. Now, this economic liberalization takes place amongst the country's biggest Achilles heel, which is its foreign exchange shortages. Now, the single biggest hurdle for the country, both economically and politically, I would argue, has been the extreme pressure on its foreign exchange reserves. Now, this is a structural problem that has plagued the country for decades. There are no easy fixes, and there's even a famous quote from Ethiopia's long-serving Minister of Finance and Economic Development, Sufyan Ahmed, who in 2009 said he didn't see the country's lack of foreign exchange reserves being resolved within his lifetime. Now, this is because Ethiopia, the country, has three main sources of foreign exchange. Firstly is exports, secondly is remittances, and thirdly is foreign direct investment, all of which face challenges. The country's exports still remain, despite moves towards industrialization across multiple sectors, including, most critically, the agricultural sector, which employs 85% of Ethiopians and accounts for 60% of GDP, still exporting raw agricultural goods with volatile price rises as a result of either domestic or external conditions. And then secondly is remittances. Now, Ethiopia's diaspora is estimated at anywhere between 3 to 4 million, and a vast majority of remittances prior to the reforms laid out at the end of July 2024 saw an estimated 85% of remittances go outside of official channels and into the parallel market. And foreign direct investment, which has seen steady growth up to the COVID-19 pandemic, started to trickle downwards, not just because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but then subsequently because of the conflict in northern Ethiopia and continued insecurity challenges. And whilst it's recovering, it's also subject to external economic climate in the investor countries, for example, China's economic slowdown as well. Now, these economic reforms and this foreign exchange crisis has been a central part of what the government has called its macroeconomic reforms, which took place at the end of July 2024, with an IMF program signed between the IMF and Ethiopia for a $3.4 billion loan program. And part of this, and that had been being negotiated for over 2 years, part of why it took that long to unlock it was because of the government concerns around what a flotation of the currency, a devaluation of the currency, what it called currency rate unification, would mean for individual or ordinary Ethiopians. And we saw that when the currency was floated at the end of July, within 6 weeks it had already lost 83% of its value. Now, this is reflected by the fact that for 2 years previously, the official rate of about 57 Ethiopian birr to the US dollar had stayed almost stagnant. But in the parallel market, you were able to receive rates of anywhere between 110 to 120 plus for the dollar, which meant that not just, for example, individual Ethiopians sending remittances would be sending it through external or through parallel channels. It would also mean that even legitimate businesses were sometimes having to go to the parallel market in order to access foreign currency. Now, one of the key concerns of this program, and one of the key concerns that has continued to be leveled, is that this is an austerity program by other means and is going to negatively impact Ethiopians, particularly those in the lower middle class and working class working people, especially at a time when there has already been significant levels of unemployment as a result of the factors, be it a drop in investment, the COVID-19 pandemic, and also conflict leading to significant displacement and economic disruption. as well. So as I mentioned, that the government, when it announced its 1 trillion budget at the end of June, quickly followed it up immediately after the end of July with another $500 billion or 500 billion budget, 40% of which was set aside for subsidies, and a substantial pay rise for the lowest paid civil servants of 300%. Now, what this does mean, though, is that the government reflects that whilst there are some positives to this, the negative impacts on individual Ethiopians is something that continues to occupy a lot of political headspace. And we saw that most recently with the governor of the National Bank, Governor Mammo, at the Ethiopian Finance Forum that was held last week in Addis Ababa, stating that he's aware that whilst official inflation figures show that the inflation is running at around 14%, that there is a difference between inflation and cost of living, having had this come back of over 2 years of 30% plus inflation month on month. Now, on the positive side, what the flotation of the currency and the devaluation has meant is that it's made exports more competitive, boosting revenues, and has helped also move the debt restructuring negotiations forward. So to give you 2 examples, in the first 10 months of this fiscal year already, Ethiopia has garnered $2.05 billion from gold exports, up from a figure of just 274 million for the entire fiscal year last year. And coffee has seen an 87% increase in the value sold in the first 10 months of this fiscal year. Now, a challenge continues to remain that whilst the initial devaluation had seen the official and parallel rates meet one another, we've now seen a divergence slowly come back again. So at the moment, at this most recent foreign currency auction, the National Bank auctioned the birr at around 133 to the US dollar, and banks are averaging around 132, whereas forex bureaus will quote you 150 birr for $1 US, and on the parallel market you can get 152 or higher. At the moment, there are even now websites that track the daily parallel market exchange rate to enable people to be able to access the best rate. And this is something that continues to be a concern for policymakers, because removing the parallel market from the wider economic sphere was a real target of these reforms. Now, I've mentioned debt restructuring and negotiations. On the debt front, a draft agreement was reached in March to restructure $8.4 billion worth of Ethiopia's debt, which will provide significant payment relief, around $2.5 billion, which is roughly the size of the country's entire foreign exchange reserve. And this is important because these negotiations, as I'd mentioned, had been ongoing for the past 2 years, and some of those had been ongoing even longer. This program particularly for 4 years, and some of this had stalled during the conflict in northern Ethiopia, when many bilateral and multilateral donors suspended some of their cooperation with the government as they criticized the conduct of the conflict. Now, the government is also anticipating progress on its IMF loan program and is projecting a substantial increase in domestic revenue collection, aiming to surpass its targets. So the government is anticipating that by the end of the fiscal year, at the end of next month, it will collect 1.5 trillion, but around $11 billion, surpassing its target of $500 billion or 500 billion as well. So this will be significant as it enters the new fiscal year in July. And these economic reforms have occurred within the broader context of opening up the economy. Now, as I mentioned, after the initial focus on telecommunications, which saw Safaricom successfully enter the market despite challenges, the next major sector that we're watching there is banking. So we can see there in the middle of this slide a picture of the first 5 local investment banks and service providers granted their licenses by the Ethiopian Capital Markets Authority. And as well, we see the Prime Minister and the CEO of the Ethiopian Securities Exchange officially ring the opening bell for the launch of Ethiopia's stock market on the 10th of January. Now, this all takes place within a significant review of existing policy and regulatory requirements. So, for example, within the banking sector, by next June 2026, local banks will have to meet a minimum capitalization requirement of 5 billion birr, which only 4 or 5 banks have achieved to date. Now, what this will mean, this will likely trigger a wave of consolidation amongst the 20 or so plus private banks. And for foreign banks looking to enter under the Banking Business Proclamation amendments that were approved in December 2024, the primary routes will be partnering with or acquiring stakes in local entities with a stated preference for banks from key African markets, most notably Kenya, South Africa, and also Nigeria. Now, a crucial issue, whether it is in telecoms, banking, or other sectors, is the persistent gap between the government's ambitious liberalization narrative and the actual on-the-ground policy and regulatory framework. The Safaricom and Paysafe case study is illustrative. When they signed their license in 2021, one of the key elements was wanting to introduce their successful M-Pesa mobile money product into the Ethiopian market. For those, many of you who are aware and follow the story of M-Pesa closely have seen how it's been able to transform so many parts of the Kenyan economy. But at the time, the regulations, particularly the National Payment System Proclamation, did not allow for foreign providers to provide mobile banking services, and it was another 2 years before M-Pesa received its license. But by then, the state-owned competitor, or formerly the state-owned monopoly, Ethio Telecom, had launched its own product, Telibirr, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. That's the very charismatic and very influential CEO of Ethio Telecom, Frehiwan Tamaro, holding her phone with the Telibirr super app, launched its own product and then gained significant market penetration as it embedded itself in services across the country, from paying for fuel in fuel stations across Addis Ababa with it, through other key services, for example, paying your water and electricity bill, both government monopolies, through to integrating payment for services such as passports and ID cards. Now, this catch-up dynamic is something that we're going to continuously see across newly open sectors, including in banking, where multiple public statements have been made by regulators and officials, including the Prime Minister, stating that liberalization is coming, foreign players are going to enter the market, and if you want to be able to compete with them, you need to be able to, or you should be looking at updating your service delivery, your technology, to ensure that you are in a position to compete. Because one of the key concerns for many who criticize this rushed, or what they see as rushed liberalization, is that if the right guardrails are not put in place, what will happen is many key state assets will be sold off for much cheaper and than expected, and then the country will start to become dominated by foreign players as well. So we've looked at the internal trajectory. What does this mean within the broader regional, geopolitical, and external context? Now, these domestic trajectories unfold within a dynamic geopolitical arena. And actually, the genesis for this webinar, as we discussed internally at Africa Practice, was a discussion, or multiple discussions we've had internally, but also with many of our clients earlier this year, where there were significant concerns about a potential for a renewed conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, the relationship had led from two decades of no war, no peace, to what was really almost an unimaginable rapprochement in 2018, with the signing of peace agreements in Asmara, and then followed more importantly and critically for the geopolitical conversation, in Jeddah and then in Abu Dhabi as well. Now, the relations were close, not just between the two countries as borders opened up, as investment opened up, but also marked close personal relations between Dr. Abiy and President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea. Now, since then, relations have, safe to say, crumbled, partly due to both a widening or a differing of perspectives on the role of Eritrea in the northern Ethiopia conflict, where it had initially been thanked for its support for the country, but now Eritrea feeling that there's a lack of gratitude for its role in the conflict, and more importantly, that it was not privy to the Pretoria Peace Agreement as a key player as well. And then secondly, this was as a result of concerns as what were formerly domestic enemies, mostly the federal government and those key players in Tigray, reconciled. Ethiopia started to make noises around access to the sea and access particularly to the Red Sea, a key point and a sore point of concern for Ethiopia-Eritrea relations previously as well. Now, despite these headlines that we'd seen in the past couple of months, headlines that sort of swept across not just local and regional press, but many international press, a renewed full-scale conflict really seemed unlikely for a multitude of reasons. Primarily, firstly, because both countries had seen the negative impact that the conflict in northern Ethiopia had on their political and diplomatic reputations. Less of an issue for Eritrea, but particularly for Ethiopia, it was an issue and had seen direct impacts on its economic investment, on diplomatic relations, and also on donor support as well. But there were also significant diplomatic efforts. So, for example, we saw a very rare convening of the entire diplomatic corps in Asmara by the Eritrean Foreign Minister Osman Saleh take place in April, asking those ambassadors to report back to their capitals and put pressure on key allies to calm down some of the rhetoric regarding conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now, the reason that's important is the diplomatic corps in Asmara compared to Addis Ababa is very minuscule, but Eritrea has a significant, long-standing and very close relations with key countries in the broader geopolitical space in the wider region, most notably Turkey, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia as well, all of whom are pictured here on the slide as well. And diplomatic efforts, including from Turkey and the UAE, also aim to de-escalate this as well. Now, I've mentioned the UAE. So what does the UAE's role in Ethiopia really mean for the country and the region as well? Now, I want to focus for a moment on the UAE, not just within the context of Ethiopia, but more broadly across the continent. At the end of last year, the UAE had reportedly overtaken China as the single largest investor across the African continent. And its role in Ethiopia is particularly pronounced, underpinned by a close personal relationship between President Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE and Dr. Abiy. In 2018, when Dr. Abiy came into power, his first significant overseas foreign visitor was actually Mohammed bin Zayed, who was then Crown Prince of the UAE. And he announced an immediate investment of $3 billion into Ethiopia's economy, which at the time equaled the country's entire foreign reserves, including a $1 billion direct deposit into the National Bank of Ethiopia. When Dr. Abiy won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, Mohammed bin Zayed not only congratulated him in Amharic on Twitter, but made sure that the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the world's tallest building, was lit in the colors of the Ethiopian flag. And this significant political, economic, and diplomatic support has also translated into military support, especially during the recent conflict in northern Ethiopia as well. And now this is part of a broader UAE strategy to build influence across the Horn, the Red Sea, and beyond. We see that with its involvement in Sudan, in Libya, in Egypt, but also through DP World, through its chain of ports across the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and further beyond. And when we talk specifically about Egypt, and I mentioned the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam earlier, that continues to be a key bone of contention between Egypt and Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country where 65% of the population still do not have access to electricity, and intermittent electricity outages and shortages are a key bone of contention for investors, particularly those looking at large-scale industrial projects, either industrial parks or refining, for example, some of the raw agricultural products in order to value add and gain more export revenues as well. Now, it's interesting because the role of the UAE here is that it's a close ally both of Ethiopia and of the UAE. And in any position between Ethiopia and the UAE, we see the slight shifting position with the UAE. So, for example, when the Arab League releases statements, arguing for Egypt's position on the GERD. The UAE is obviously a member of the Arab League, and we have to remember that whilst the UAE remains a close ally of Ethiopia, its investments in Cairo and in far outweigh those its investments in Ethiopia. For example, an announcement over the past 2 years of $35 billion of investment into Egypt. But we shouldn't read too far into this, because this is really part of the broader UAE strategy, which is building that solid wall of support across the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean, be it from Libya, through Egypt, through Sudan, through Ethiopia, Djibouti, and beyond as well. And whilst we talk about this, the role of the UAE, we should not negate the role of other key bilateral partners for Ethiopia. China, although its investment levels are slowing down, it still remains one of Ethiopia's largest investors, and also Ethiopia's single largest debtor as well. So whilst many of the frameworks for debt restructuring are happening with, for example, the IMF or with individual countries, the biggest deal will need to be made with Beijing, especially because much of the infrastructure that has been built over the past 3 decades has been built not just by Chinese construction companies, but with Chinese loans as well. And then we see the other role of other core Middle Eastern players, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both vying for geopolitical competition in not just in Africa, but across other spheres as well. Interestingly, we've seen that as the US has tacked closer to Ethiopia, we've seen Eritrea pivot even more towards Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, for example, announcing a $1 billion investment into the port of Assad in southern Eritrea, which ironically, if Ethiopia and Eritrea were to get on much better and an agreement was able to be signed, would be a core port for Ethiopia and remove the reliance on Djibouti, where 95% of Ethiopia's imports and exports currently enter, which remains a chokehold for the country, not just in terms of logistically, but also because of the more than $1.4 billion spent every year on port fees to Djibouti. And it was really that led to, in 2024, the signing of the MOU between Ethiopia and Somaliland for a port deal in Berbera, which in hindsight, whilst it may not have been admitted, was very much seen as a mistake by Ethiopia's political and diplomatic elite, especially as many of its own allies came out in support of Somalia's territorial integrity and against the MOU. And a concern that any recognition, for example, of Somaliland, which was part of the deal, would result in other secessionist movements across the African continent being supported. But eventually, it took Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Turkey, a key ally of both Ethiopia and Somalia, to sign the Ankara Agreement in December 2024, which is continuing to be implemented and which will allow for Ethiopia to have other outlets to the sea. But this access to a seaport is a continuing dominant domestic narrative in the country, and it's something that we need to continue, or we will be continuing closely to watch, because there's a concern that at any time, if that narrative spills over into actual military moves, that it could provide a concern for neighbors and or for other partners concerned around another conflict batting up rising in the region. And then finally, the role of Iran as well. Iran's an interesting case. That's very much led by the dynamics within the broader Middle East. Now, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran, as they've had their rapprochement and they've all joined BRICS together alongside with Ethiopia, we've seen much more closer cooperation between Ethiopia and Iran. And that picture you see there was just less than 3 weeks ago, the commissioner of the Ethiopian Federal Police and the head of Iran's police signing a security agreement, something that would have been unimaginable when Ethiopia was much more pivot in the Saudi UAE pivot, and when it had broken off relations under the former Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn as well. So as we look back at Ethiopia today and as we head into the elections next year, I want to come back to this quote. We see ongoing efforts for political consolidation by the Prosperity Party, but highly localized dynamics at play. Macroeconomic reforms continue, with hopes of an economic pickup as the government works to restore frayed international relations. So what does this all mean if you're a policymaker or investor looking at Ethiopia? I've used this quote here, and that success in the country requires patience even by African standards. And what this means, firstly, is recognizing that there are multiple layers of decision-making and a complex web of stakeholders across all levels that require close engagement. Secondly, there continues to be a pronounced gap between stated political goals and the often lagging policy and regulatory frameworks. It's vital to understand what's currently possible under the current regulations and policies and what's promised, and note that that will have an impact on timelines. I mentioned the timelines between, for example, Safaricom signing its license in 2021 and being able to launch its mobile money product 2 years later, and same with pronouncements in 2022 and 2023 stating that the banking sector was imminently to be opened up, followed by the recognition that multiple parts of Ethiopia's legal framework had to be updated, from the Financial Services Code through to the Banking Business Proclamation as well. And thirdly, it's truly understanding that the localized dynamics are central to Ethiopia's trajectory. Ethiopia's complexity isn't really confined to Addis, and with a push for investment beyond the capital, both by the federal and national and subnational governments, grasping the local security and socio-political landscape is critical. Now, it's important to remember that even at the height of recent conflicts, while some donors and companies withdrew, others quietly maintained their investments and are now beginning to see the fruits of that perseverance, which taps into another quality that is required for investment and operation in Ethiopia, and that's really resilience. This underscores that with deep understanding, patience, and a nuanced approach, opportunities can indeed be unlocked. And as it takes patience in Ethiopia, I thank you for your patience and for listening to me. And I'd now like to open the floor to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teddy, for the insightful presentation. We've covered a lot of grounds today, from internal politics, security, to economic fragilities and shifting regional alliances. We now will move on to the Q&A session. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance during the registration process and thereafter. I'll start by the first 3 questions and move on to the others. First question, Theodros, potential alternatives to Abiy Ahmed for the leadership. Second question, what are the growth opportunities for Ethiopia, specifically around digital inclusion? And third question, how would you describe the current relationship with the US? Then we'll move on to the next 3 after this.
Great. So the first question, alternatives for leadership. There's a short and a long answer, and the short is none, because some of those who would be seen as potential alternatives to the leadership or potential competitors have either exited the domestic political sphere as a result of their own decisions, or have been quietly pushed to the sidelines as well. One trend that we've seen over the past 7 years is that some of those that were in critical positions of importance, so either Sahle-Work Zewde at the presidency, Maaza Ashanafi at the Federal Supreme Court, Burtukan Mideksa at the National Electoral Board, all of them, for one reason or other, without stating their reasons, have left administration. Now, that's primarily, and we know that as a result of the political and economic opening up and ability to, that very much high hopes were instilled in their offices, that as they started to face the realities of the challenges, be it Maaza Ashanafi as a result of increased alleged corruption within the judicial sector, or with Burtukan Mideksa at the Electoral Board, as you saw the complexities of the local elections come up, they've really left the political scene. And then more importantly is that process of co-option. So I mentioned at the beginning that in 2021, what the government did, which for Ethiopia is quite revolutionary, maybe not so in other countries that are used to coalition governments, is that despite the ruling party winning the elections significantly, it made sure to have 3 cabinet seats for opposition parties. So by chance, it's already co-opted those opposition parties. So then you're also sitting in a position where, for example, the National Movement of Amhara has parliamentarians who are very critical of the government in parliament, but they also have a minister sitting in government, Dr. Balat Amola, who's the Minister of Information Technology, who's responsible for many of the key decisions in the country. So this alternatives leadership have been made sure to have not been there. Now, the concern is that there needs to be a balance, that where there are potential centers of power, they may be put in other positions of power, particularly regional presidents, right? And the concern there would be of regional presidents of the likes of Shimelis Abdissa and Oromia, or in Tigray. Previously it was Debretsion Gebremichael, but Getachew Reda, who now has gone from the interim administration to a position in federal government as the Prime Minister's advisors. So often the process is that when these challenges do come, they're co-opted into a role within government. And it could be domestically or could also be externally as well. And then second question was around the opportunities around digital inclusion, or the opportunities more broadly. Now, we've talked a bit about the opening of the telecommunication sector and the opening of the banking sector. And that digital inclusion point is very critical, because we're talking about a country where 2/3 of the country remains unbanked as well. And I was even watching a conversation with one of the CEOs of a local investment bank, who said, just because banks are opening multiple branches in Addis Ababa and they're all building new headquarters, that doesn't mean you're going to impact the majority of the population. The real success and the opportunities there will be outside of Addis Ababa. It will be at subnational level in the secondary cities, the regional capitals, the secondary cities, and then specifically amongst core communities to Ethiopia's economic trajectory. That's farmers, and then also many of the small business holders as well. So those opportunities are going to be outside of the country, outside of the capital, but outside of the capital brings with it an additional level of complexity, because there are localized security dynamics at play. There's a whole range of local stakeholders at regional level, regional state, then at Warada, at zone level, then at Warada level, and sometimes even down to Kabale, which is the local district, the very smallest unit of administration in Ethiopia, that will need to be engaged in order to be able to build that out. Because, for example, when we look at financial inclusion, it's not just about digital inclusion, it's also about education as well. But the education system is itself suffering from underinvestment, a lack of skilled personnel, significant internal displacement that has meant that, let alone at higher education, at primary and secondary school, Ethiopia has the highest number of out-of-school children, or second highest in all of Africa, for example. So managing these domestic challenges is going to be important for the country if it wants to widen. It wants to widen financial and broader digital inclusion as well. And then there also is an infrastructure gap as well. We mentioned the electricity point as well, but it's not just about electricity generation from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance time. It's about also transmission and last mile transmission to the 85% of Ethiopians that still live in very rural communities as well across the country. And then when you start to look at communities, for example, in Eastern Ethiopia, where many of them are nomadic pastoralists and not in settled communities, how do you ensure that you're able to reach them as well? And then the third question was around relations with the US and where relations with the US stand now. Now, relations with the US, they are much warmer than they were at their low point during the conflict in northern Ethiopia, particularly between 2020 and 2022. But they're not back where they used to be, primarily because, for example, Ethiopia was ejected from the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, and is not going to be back into it anytime soon. And we at Africa Practice have also been looking at, and I have colleagues here who've been looking at AGOA, which is looks likely to be sunset by the US administration as well. And even during the conflict, the US still maintained its significant levels of emergency bilateral aid as well. Now, where the concerns are that during the tail end of the last Trump administration, there was concern that much of the focus from the Trump administration, particularly around the GERD issue, was around supporting Egypt as well. And I think there was that infamous phone call where President Trump was sitting in the Oval Office, was on the phone with President Sisi of Egypt, and asked the question about why the Egyptians just didn't bomb the dam as well. And even then, during the negotiations, Ethiopia had said that the negotiations should be held directly or trilaterally between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, whereas the US was insisting on involvement or mediation from the US Treasury. So relations at the moment, they are warmer than they used to. They are warmer than they used to be. But particularly where the concern will be is now with the freezing of USAID funding, what that actually means for the country. Now the country has tried or is trying to use other domestic means. They've just announced that, for example, they will add an additional. They need to add another additional tax onto workers for what they call the Disaster and Relief Recovery Fund. Now, there's no way you're going to plug a gap left by USAID just from domestic revenue alone. That's really where relations sit. They're much warmer, but not where they used to be particularly prior to the conflict in northern Ethiopia. And Ethiopia really during that period of the conflict was particularly critical of the US as well. So that's not forgotten in Washington, DC, and the country spent much of its time pivoting to other key players. We've talked about the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey as well. But they also have significant influence in Washington, DC, as we saw President Trump's visit to the UAE and Saudi Arabia recently. So there is also a back channel to the US as well through both Abu Dhabi and Riyadh as well.
Thank you very much, Teddy. I'll move on to the next questions. For diaspora investors, what are the most promising opportunities inherent in the recent liberalization reforms? Second question, the Ethiopian government has long prioritized developing its manufacturing sector, particularly in industrial parks. As global supply chains continue to realign, how is Ethiopia repositioning itself to attract manufacturers looking to diversify?
Okay, so the first question is sectors for diaspora investment. So I've mentioned that actually over the past year, you've seen quite a significant increase in the number of sectors where proclamations have been announced stating that the sector is now open for foreign investment as well. And initially, often the step that Ethiopia has taken previously is that they have a sector, for example, that's only available to domestic investors. Then the next stage to opening up is to say, we will allow it for foreign investors, but it's only for foreign investors of Ethiopian origin, and specifically those, for example, with what Ethiopia calls an Ethiopian origin ID card, the famous yellow card. Now, Ethiopia, for context, does not allow dual citizenship, but if you are of Ethiopian origin, you are able to get an ID card that affords you many of the rights similar to Ethiopian citizens. So, for example, being able to enter and exit the country. We will live in the country, work in multiple sectors apart from those that are deemed sensitive by the government, and then also invest and even buy shares. So, for example, with the banking sector at the moment, it remains officially closed off to foreign investors, but if you are a foreign national of Ethiopian origin, you're able to buy bank shares, for example. Then we've mentioned also some other sectors, mentioned retail. And retail, initially it was expected that only, for example, import-export was going to be open to foreign investors, or maybe wholesale. But the proclamation that was announced in March 2024 actually said the entire retail supply chain, from commercial all the way through to import-export and wholesale as well. Now that opens up a whole different avenue, because that will mean you will get the bigger players that are involved in the import-export, logistics, transport, in the retail sector, through to local and regional supermarket chains as well. So that's what you see. So the retail sector. Then we've also got the agricultural extension services sector as well. And then most importantly and most critically is the real estate sector. Now, the real estate sector, this is more controversial because land ownership in Ethiopia, and we've seen many of the issues that we've spoken about over the course of this webinar, be it security issues, be it issues that have led to states of emergency, have been as a result of land as well. And the proclamation for real estate investment has been very much focused at the diaspora, but the prices that you often see are significantly higher than you'd expect in a market. So there's a concern that, for example, already, even before foreign nationals were allowed to own property, even just investment by the diaspora had already seen ballooning of prices. So, for example, you have the joy of being quoted $500,000 US for a one-bedroom apartment in the center of Addis Ababa, which might not sound like a lot for those sitting in, say, London, New York, or Washington, D.C., but for Ethiopia, it's significantly beyond most of the reach of 99% of locals. And even those from the diaspora, there's a concern that if that's, what does that mean for that investment? If you are investing in real estate under Ethiopia's laws, and since the 1974 revolution, all land is state-owned and land is leased. And we've seen also concerns because not just in Addis Ababa, but in secondary cities across the country, that a number of city construction projects called corridor development projects have taken place. So we've seen significant demolition of existing residential properties. So there's concern, for example, if you invest in the real estate sector, will you then be a target for demolition as well? But specifically focused on the role of the diaspora, the government has been very focused on ensuring that it can increase the role of the diaspora, because there's a recognition that much of the investment that is going to come to the country is going to come from Ethiopians and those of Ethiopian origin abroad. So, for example, with the foreign currency reforms, one of the things that was done was that the National Bank Governor and the head of the Ethiopian Diaspora Agency was sent on a tour around various diaspora capitals, key diaspora capitals, including Washington, D.C., speaking to the diaspora, launching apps to allow people to send remittances directly to their families via applications rather than through hawala or other informal money mechanism systems, to ensure that that money remains within the formal economic system as well. And we've seen even from the government's own figures that remittances increased from $4 billion to $6 billion by their own records. Now, whether that is completely accurate is a different story, because we have seen that there have been issues sometimes where certain figures might have been inflated for various reasons as well. So that's that question and those sectors. And then when we talk about the industry and the supply chains, now global supply chains continue to hamper Ethiopia's economic trajectory, not least because it is the largest landlocked country on the planet, largest as in most populous, and as mentioned, more than 95% of its trade just goes through the port of Djibouti. So even, for example, we saw during the conflict in northern Ethiopia, one of the key routes for Tigrayan forces as they marched towards Addis was to actually cut off the Addis Ababa to Djibouti road, which then meant they would have been able to chokehold the country as well. And the industrial parks also took a significant hit during the conflict because many foreign investors withdrew, particularly in sectors such as textiles. And that wasn't just because of the conflict, it was the dual whammy of the conflict and then Ethiopia's expulsion or withdrawal from AGOA, because many of those international textiles retailers had set up not just because of lower labor costs, but because of access to the US market through AGOA. So it's estimated that indirectly more than 1 million jobs were impacted by the withdrawal of AGOA. Now, what the government has done is that it still wants to focus on the industrial parks. And whilst there were industrial parks, for example, in northern Ethiopia, Mekelle and Kombolcha, that were severely damaged, there were others in the country that weren't, and that have continued their work. And what the government has done is consolidated state entities, particularly the Industrial Parks Development Corporation, under the umbrella of the Ethiopian Investment Holdings and the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So the government is not looking just for investors in individual industrial parks, but is looking for investors to take over the running of all of the industrial parks more broadly. So that industrial park strategy is still central to what Ethiopia is doing. What will be critical for Ethiopia, though, is that the global supply chains have impacted Ethiopia because Ethiopia remains at its base a country that has to import even some of its most basic needs. And we're talking from things as basic as flour through to cooking oil, despite, for example, multi-billion birr factories being built in order to provide cooking oil for the Ethiopian population. Anywhere between 40 and 60% of cooking oil in the country is imported, which is ironic given that oilseeds are one of Ethiopia's top agricultural exports. But there is a gap between the oilseeds that are farmed in various parts of Ethiopia and then being pushed through the supply chain, processed, and being able to be sold domestically as well. So much of the concentration will be focusing on domestic challenges. And I think that relates to I know a question that was received and was discussed, which is where the focus needs to be. And that's really where the focus, much of the policy and domestic focus needs to be. The past 2-3 years, particularly with the conflict in northern Ethiopia, yes, it's seen Ethiopia focus on its domestic challenges, but actually had to spend a lot of capital sort of fighting off or trying to repair diplomatic relations, but also trying to fight off negative or worsening relations, be it with key donors such as the EU or the US and various individual European countries, with fighting a war on multiple fronts in the country. But now we have the Pretoria Agreement, however shaky it may be in northern Ethiopia, but also other peace agreements in other regions, and an election next year, political consolidation taking place. Focusing on these domestic political and economic challenges is going to be critical for the country as well.
Thank you so much, Teddy, for your response. We have about 3 questions left, including one that has come in through the chat just now. We have about 10 minutes, and hopefully we'll be able to get to all the 3 of them before we end. First question, how is the peace and reconciliation process translating into a more secure and predictable environment for long-term capital investment? Second question, where should Ethiopia focus more in terms of development, given both internal, external, and global current challenges?
Okay.
And then I'll get to the last one that came in through the chat after this.
Good, thank you. Thank you. So on the first question, so the long-term peace and reconciliation agreements, they have not entirely solved the domestic political situation or the domestic security situation. But what it's meant is there's been a much more of a nuanced and much more fragmented picture. One of the things we didn't even mention in the webinar is the particular concern that localized insecurity is now starting to see an increase, not just in political actors that may be fighting for political aims, but also criminal actors as well. For example, with increases in kidnapping rates in various parts of the country. Now, this remains a concern for longer-term capital investment, but much of the energy particularly has been actually focused, firstly, when we look at the domestic picture, on the Pretoria Agreement in northern Ethiopia, primarily because that consumes so much of the country's energy in various ways. In Amhara, which is the second most popular region, in Tigray, third most populous region, in Afar, had also roped in other external powers as well. Excuse me. But the government is continuing to try and sign multiple peace agreements. As I mentioned, it signed a peace agreement with a splinter faction of the Oromo Liberation Front in December 2024, and that's been taken forward as well. Now, and then the third element is that much of the focus has been on external relations, on improving external relations. So the government is also working hard on not just improving its diplomatic relations, but restoring donor funding that have been cut, but also focusing on building security and military relations with multiple countries. So I mentioned the security agreement signed between Ethiopia and Iran. The chief of police for Dubai and the chief of the Iranian police were guests at the Ethiopian Police Day celebrations earlier this month. The Ethiopian defense minister was conducting a tour of Central Europe earlier this month in Prague, focusing specifically on defense technology and military technology as well. So there's a concern and there's a recognition that the state, particularly the federal state and regional states, need to get a grip of the security situation across regions, because if they don't get a grip of the situation across regions, before we even look at longer term capital investment and foreign investment, even domestic economic sectors will struggle. And when domestic economic sectors struggle, that will either lead to one of two outcomes: either social unrest, or we will continue to see higher migration numbers for Ethiopians leaving the country, be it through the Gulf route, through Djibouti, through to the Gulf Arab states, through Sudan, despite it being war-torn, via Libya, the Mediterranean route, or southwards onto Southern Africa, particularly to join the estimated more than 1 million Ethiopians that are working in South Africa as well. So, and with that, you're losing unskilled population, you're losing skilled population as well. So that concern, particularly around security, is something that is very much a focus of the government's aims. But that is only going to happen, or that reconciliation is only going to happen in an environment where those non-state actors that are acting against the state believe that they have a viable partner in the federal government to be able to create a conducive environment for economic investment, but also broader political and social reconciliation. And that's really something that I've not mentioned throughout this whole webinar, but one thing that's been important and underlying this is the national dialogue process. So there was a recognition even during the conflict in northern Ethiopia, but post 2018, that there's significant issues, be it the issue of ethnicity and the role of ethnicity in politics, the role of class, the role of economic development, the role of women, the tensions between urban and rural areas, the role between settled communities, pastoralist communities, that would require national dialogue. So there is a National Dialogue Commission whose work is being undertaken. At the moment, it's continuing its tour around the country and garnering agenda points. And that stop-started as a result of the conflict. But whether that national dialogue process really continues and is really able to lead Ethiopia into a period of economic and social reconciliation will be critical to building that environment. And I have to state, for the benefit, that some of these issues are not issues that just emerged in the last 7 years. Some of these issues have been going on for decades, some of which go back all the way to the Ethiopian Revolution 51 years ago now. This isn't a lecture on Ethiopian political history, but it's critical to understand some of those: the role of land, the role of class, the role of the other potential conflict touchpoints, the role of ethnicity, that are going to be critical to building that environment going forward. And the second question, Helena.
The last question, you mean?
Yes, the last question. Thank you.
So the last question is, will the fact that opposition parties are part of the ruling coalition help to tamp down any potential socio-political risk ahead of the election next year? Or could a heated election campaign inflame tensions? Will those parties keep their criticism of Abiy and his party in check in the hopes of being part of the cabinet and government again?
Good question. Essentially, it's going to, what will mean is, what we will see over the next year is we're already seeing this, in that those parties that have individual cabinet members in the cabinet, you sort of see the slight dichotomy where their parties will release statements very critical of the government, but the ministers themselves will not say anything, right? So they've already been co-opted into these positions. And there's a concern, and whilst it's not necessarily stated within these political parties, was that being co-opted into the administration, was that the right place to be in? So, for example, if we take the national movement of Amhara. They have a minister in cabinet. They also have parliamentarians that are very critical of the government, that are in parliament and will actively speak against the government. Now, in terms of what this will mean for tensions, because many of the opposition parties, there's actually more than 100 plus opposition parties registered at the National Electoral Board. Many of these are very small and very localized, representing small areas or small ethnic groups. They're often very fragmented. They're not going to have a national stage. The Prosperity Party and its regional affiliates, prosperity parties in each of the regions, dominate the conversation. They won't keep their criticism of Abiy and his party in check. And it will also mean the government is also attuned that it needs an outlet for political dissent and social dissent as well, because it will need to ensure that if you don't have an outlet for that it could lead to other forms of dissent, either particularly given the security situation, the localized security dynamics, forming into either violent protests and so forth, which is not what the government wants to see, what individuals want to see, but is not something that would be useful for the country and its image and its political image. And that I keep coming back to that point of this image in the webinar, because that's been really critical, because that optimism, as it's faded over the past 7 years and that really took a hit between 2020 and 2022, is an image that the country is trying to continuously trying to rebuild. The campaign, the political campaign, already started. I think it started the day after the 2021 election as well. And you're already seeing it, for example, when we look at the corridor development projects and the beautification projects that I talked about. Those are not just taking place in Addis Ababa, they're taking place in cities across the country, in regional capitals and secondary cities. So that building of infrastructure, that building of new housing, for example, where people who've been removed from districts of central Addis Ababa have been demolished, have been given housing on the outskirts of the city, where we're seeing a rise in civil service payments, where we're seeing subsidies being allocated to offset the costs of the impacts of rising prices. These are all, whilst they're not formally stated, these are all parts of the election, the election campaign. What will be critical is, as I mentioned, some of those localized races. What will the opposition parties in Oromia do? Are they going to be very critical of the government? Will they come out forcefully, or will they just boycott the elections and give the Prosperity Party a free run? What's happening in Tigray? What will the cancellation of the TPLF from the electoral list mean? So that's what I mean. Looking at these localized dynamics is going to be extremely, extremely important. Could the government turn around and say, well, we've had opposition parties boycott in Oromia, we're going to win all the seats. Tigray's only 38 seats in parliament. We've got most of the other regions. We're fine as is. We still have a significant majority that will enable us to pass legislation. Who knows? And we'll see how that unfolds over the year.
Thank you very much, Teddy. We're exactly on time, which is great. I hope all your questions were answered satisfactorily, but if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to share them with us. As we wrap up, I really want to start by extending sincere gratitude to our speaker, Theodros, for his expert insight. And of course, a huge thanks to you, to all of you, for joining us and for your engaging questions. A few takeaway from today's session. We've heard that Ethiopia is a nation, navigating deep reform setbacks amid conflict and shifting regional dynamics. We've heard that ongoing crises in the Amhara and Oromo region demand careful risk assessment. We've also heard about the inflation and forex shortages that persist, but the banking reforms show some potential. The country, the regional environment remains volatile. Here we're talking about Sudan, Eritrea, GERD, and Somalia. And finally, the country's BRICS membership signals a pivot in Ethiopia's international alliances. So in conclusion, All this means is for those who really want to engage, the country offers both significant challenges and compelling long-term opportunities. It just requires a deep contextual intelligence, it requires informed engagement, and it requires adaptive strategies. I see we have another. Okay, sorry, we don't have. Just before we officially close, I'd like to share an important announcement. Building on today's discussion, we will be hosting a second webinar in the coming weeks, and we'll specifically compare and contrast development models in the Horn of Ethiopia, looking at, in the Horn of Africa, looking at Ethiopia and Eritrea. We'll also examine the political and economic roles of diaspora communities in the region. With this, once again, thank you to all of you. Thank you, Teddy, for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you in the next webinar.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Helena. Thank you all. Have a great day further.